So, with that said, we are going to transition to the Packers and the Cowboys game. And this was another phenomenal game that we saw this past weekend. And the Packers stabilize. I mean, if you're a Packers fan, you're probably thinking, thank God that they stabilized because, I mean, they were this close to losing 6 straight games. So, I mean, the Packers definitely needed this game just because, well, I've been on the mindset that their playoff chances are pretty much dead in the water at this point. And they would have been just completely dead in the water had they lost this game to the Cowboys. But they were able to rally in that fourth quarter to be able to force an overtime. And then that Packers defense was able to get a stop against Dallas's offense in overtime. And then Aaron Rodgers was able to lead a drive for the Packers to set them up for the game-winning field goal, and they did. So they won the game with a score of 31-28. Like I said, the Packers moved to a 4-6 record. The Cowboys bumped down to a 6-3 record. Let's focus on the Packers here because the Packers definitely need to be discussed simply just because they won the game. The Packers needed this win. There's no other way to say it. And Kevin and I know he's not here right now. We've already discussed that the Packers season is basically over as far as their playoff chances are concerned. Just because when you look at the landscape of the NFC, or actually I'll just focus more on the NFC North, the Vikings are absolutely running away with that division. And it doesn't seem like the Packers are going to be able to be competitive in that capacity. Just because I think the Vikings are probably going to win that division probably within the next couple of weeks or so. They could probably win that division probably by the first or second week in December, just with how effective that they've been. I mean, they're at an 8-1 record, and the Packers are sitting 2 games under 500. So unless the Vikings were to absolutely fall apart, the Packers aren't going to be competitive in that division. But this is a game that they needed to win, and Aaron Rodgers stepped up. Because when you looked at that Lions game last week, he was atrocious in that game. The Packers offense scored 9 points. They weren't even able to get a touchdown against the Lions last week. And going up against a team like the Cowboys, man, they needed to be on their A game just because the Cowboys are one of the better teams in the NFC this year, and they are not a team to be trifled with. And yet, the Packers were able to do just enough to get by the Cowboys in this one. And when I look at this game specifically, I'll be honest with you. I really thought that once the Cowboys got it to a 28-14 margin, I just didn't think that the Packers were going to have enough firepower to be able to lead some drives to put points on the board. Yet I was wrong. And Aaron Rodgers was able to lead the offense effectively to not only get the margin down to a 7-point deficit, but to eventually tie it, in the later stages of the fourth quarter. And, one of the best things that I could look at with Aaron Rodgers this week is that he didn't turn the ball over. You look at that Lions game last week, he was turning the ball over left and right. He's had an abnormal amount of interceptions this year compared to some of his MVP seasons that we've seen just in the last couple of years. But this definitely seemed like more of a vintage type game from Aaron Rodgers. He definitely looked a lot more comfortable in this game compared to those games where they were losing 5 in a row. And, not only that, for them to be able to get a stop defensively in overtime against the Cowboys, that was huge. And then Aaron Rodgers did his thing in that overtime position to just get them in the field goal range and get them the win. So, when I look at the Packers right here, the Packers are still a team that we should at least be aware of. We should still keep our eyes on them simply just because it is Aaron Rodgers. He's one of the best quarterbacks in NFL history. And we need to see if he could really start exceeding expectations for the rest of the year, because as far as I see it, they still got a long way to go, even to be competitive in some sort of playoff chance scenario. I'm of the mindset that the hole is too deep to dig out of at this point. If they can, it's going to have to be on the back of Aaron Rodgers, and the defense is going to have to step up to make turnovers, because that's what the defense was able to do yesterday against the Cowboys. Honestly, that's what kept them in it as far as I'm concerned. They were able to force some turnovers against Dak Prescott and that Cowboys offense. And that, to me, dictated the outcome of the game just from the defensive side, because had the Packers not gotten those turnovers, I'm of the mindset that the Cowboys could have put up 40 points in that game. Just because, that Cowboys offense was humming in large stretches in that second half. The first half was competitive. It was really kind of a back and forth affair in the first half. But that second half, the Cowboys really got into rhythm. They could not, when I talk about I'm talking about the Packers defense. The Packers defense could not contain CeeDee Lamb yesterday in any way, shape, or form. He was by far and away the best receiver for the Cowboys yesterday, and he showed it. He had 2 touchdowns, had over 100 yards receiving, and no matter what sort of defensive package that the Packers presented the Cowboys, they just couldn't slow him down. And not only that, I thought Tony Pollard was extremely effective yesterday, not only in the running game for Dallas, but in the passing game as well. He was able to get a couple of receptions and pick up some extra yards for their offense. But, just to kind of round it back to the Packers here, that Packers defense stepped up when they needed to be able to keep that Packers offense in a position where they could at least try to tie the game. So there were some drives by the Cowboys in that fourth quarter where they could have essentially put, the nail in the coffin for the Packers, but they just weren't able to execute. And that's where you got to give a lot of credit to that Packers defense for being able to step up in the manner that they did to be able to at least keep themselves in the game. And, when it comes to the Packers do not have a lot of wiggle room here. They have to be essentially pinpoint to be able to win these games, just because, when I look at the offense, they've really had their struggles this year. And this is probably one of the first games that they've had, I'd say probably in the last month and a half, where they've looked like the Packers offense of old, and they were able to put up 30 points on the board. So, it's a lot of credit to them. But, just to kind of round out the Packers part here, the Packers really got to be on their A game for the rest of the year. They cannot afford to lose games that they just simply can't lose. Or let me rephrase that. They can't afford to lose games where they should be able to win those games effectively, because they've dropped some games this year where they should have won. And, we got 2 months left in the season. We'll see whether or not that they could really get on some sort of hot streak here. I'm still a little bit pessimistic about them, just because their chemistry issues offensively have been just too consistent this year. Maybe this is a turning point for them. Maybe they just needed this win against the Cowboys to get themselves a spark. And we'll see whether or not that it can transition into winning, 3, 4, 5 games in a row. But I'm still very heavily pessimistic about the Packers. I need to see more consistency from them on the offensive side of the ball. And their defense. The defense has really been the one thing that's kept them in it this year. And as long as they're able to force turnovers, get that ball back to Aaron Rodgers in the offense, it gives themselves a chance. And I'll just kind of leave it at that. But a great win for the Packers. They definitely needed it. And we'll see whether or not that they can continue it for the second half of the season. There's a lot of ground for them to catch up. We'll see whether or not they can possibly get back into some sort of playoff type scenario here.